The stabilized hum of the canopy node faded into the quiet background as Mara turned her attention to the newly identified maintenance shaft hidden behind the interface floor. She knelt by the access panel, lifting the heavy hatch clear. Below lay a narrow service ladder, its rungs worn smooth by centuries of forgotten footsteps. Mara secured her harness and began her descent, letting gravity guide her into the sub-level corridor. The air grew still and cool as she moved away from the main chamber, but the silence was not absolute. Faint thermal gradients pulsed through the stone and metal, a subtle warmth that drew her deeper like a compass needle settling north. She followed the heat slowly, step by careful step, letting the quiet rhythm of her breathing match the slow pulse of the dormant way station around her. At the end of the corridor, the thermal gradient sharpened into a steady warmth. Mara's boots came to rest before a sealed blast door, its heavy surface etched with faded ecological glyphs that had survived long after their original purpose had slipped from memory. She ran a gloved hand over the carvings, noting the delicate interplay of botanical and hydrological motifs that marked this space as something other than mere machinery. The symbols spoke of balance, of systems designed to breathe and adapt rather than dominate. Mara stepped back and raised her diagnostic scanner, calibrating the frequency to match the ambient resonance of the surrounding architecture. Its beams swept across the door, projecting a clear readout onto her visor. The data confirmed what the glyphs had quietly suggested. She stood before the entrance to a dormant climate archive, a sub-level vault where centuries of atmospheric records had been preserved in crystalline lattice storage. She adjusted the scanner's focus, running a deeper structural analysis through the sealed barrier. The readout expanded, mapping the internal architecture with precise clarity. Mara watched as the diagnostic highlighted the archive's primary intake valves, revealing centuries of geological settling and mineral deposition that had gradually closed them off. The crystallization was extensive, a beautiful but immovable network of calcified deposits that had woven through the mechanical joints over generations. Soft amber warnings confirmed that forced entry would inevitably rupture the ancient pressure seals. The system was designed to protect its contents from sudden environmental shifts, and centuries of quiet mineral growth had only reinforced that original safeguard. Mara noted the exact load limits and stress points, cataloging the structural integrity of every adjacent support beam before lowering her scanner. With the diagnostic complete, Mara stepped back from the threshold and established a temporary work perimeter using her portable marker tape. She pulled a handheld log terminal from her utility belt, its screen glowing with a gentle blue light against the dim corridor. With practiced efficiency, she logged the discovery, documenting the location, the glyph etchings, and the full scope of the mineral crystallization. The data streamed into her local archive, cross-referenced with the broader transit network patterns she had already mapped across the sector. As she worked, Mara reflected on the implications of finding such a carefully sealed vault. Direct access was no longer an option, but the structural preservation protocols offered a clear pathway forward that honored the original design. Any future intervention would need to prioritize maintaining the integrity of the fused infrastructure while slowly working around its natural aging process. The quiet of the sub-level settled around her, punctuated only by the soft whir of her terminal and the distant resonance of the canopy grid above. Mara reviewed the logged entries one final time, ensuring every coordinate and stress measurement was accurately captured before closing the device. She stood for a moment longer, listening to the faint thermal currents that continued to flow through the walls, carrying whispers of archived climates from a long quiet past. The archive was real, its location verified, and its contents protected by centuries of patient geological work. Yet the sealed door remained exactly where it had been, an immovable barrier between her and the data within. Access to the archive is confirmed, but physically blocked by fused infrastructure. The archive antechamber hummed with a quiet, dormant potential, its air cool and still against Mara's work-worn gloves. She unrolled the faded thermal regulator schematics across her portable drafting table, the parchment-like material settling with a soft whisper of static. Above her, the secondary signal from the mapped coordinate continued its faint, rhythmic pulse through the way station's structural ribs. She adjusted the harmonic variance display on her wrist terminal, watching the waveform drift and settle into familiar patterns. Correlating the incoming data with the dome original thermal architecture revealed a deliberate symmetry. The variance was not noise, it was a signature. Each peak and trough corresponded precisely to the cooperative calibration matrix she had decoded from the navigation array earlier that cycle. The architects had not left behind rigid instructions or automated overseers. They had woven their intent into the very frequency of the environment, trusting future stewards to listen before they acted. Mara traced the overlapping waveforms with a calloused finger, feeling the subtle vibration travel through the table's surface. The thermal patterns showed how atmospheric balance had been maintained for centuries without mechanical force or centralized command centers. Instead, the builders relied on distributed resonance, allowing mineral deposits and atmospheric regulators to interact through natural harmonic shifts. It was an elegant system, designed to adapt rather than dictate. She understood immediately that forcing a hardline connection would shatter decades of delicate equilibrium. The archive core required an invitation, not an override. She moved to her equipment satchel, retrieving previously salvaged components. A coil of conductive wire unspooled with a metallic sigh, its insulation worn but intact. Next came the repurposed harmonic resonator, currently functioning as a bypass conduit for the navigation array calibration loop. Its primary crystal lattice had been temporarily stabilized, leaving the housing free to accept new parameters. Mara worked methodically, stripping the wire ends and soldering them to the resonator auxiliary ports. The connections held firm under her steady hands, completing a temporary circuit that would translate raw harmonic input into controlled physical vibration. Focusing on calibration, she adjusted the emitter array modulators to mimic the slow pressure of natural tectonic shifts. The goal was not to break through sealed barriers, but to gently encourage mineral deposits loose enough to permit airflow without triggering legacy pressure sensors. She ran a diagnostic simulation on her terminal, watching the virtual waveforms interact with the simulated archive intake valves. The resonance spread outward in soft concentric rings, dissolving friction points just enough to create a passage for environmental currents. No sudden spikes, no jarring transients, just a steady, patient cadence that honored the original design philosophy. Mara double-checked every connection, ensuring the bypass conduit would handle the load without overheating. The stabilized canopy environmental grid provided ample capacity, but she preferred to keep margins generous when working with dormant infrastructure. She secured the emitter array to her shoulder harness and moved toward the heavy intake valves that guarded the archive core. The metal was cool to the touch, etched with faded ecological glyphs that marked its function as a breathing lung for the entire way station. She knelt beside the first valve, positioning the emitters at precise angles where mineral buildup had begun to constrict the flow channels. With practiced efficiency, she routed the auxiliary cables through existing maintenance grooves, avoiding stress points and preserving the structural integrity of the housing. Each emitter was anchored with quickset adhesive strips, its frequency dial locked into the calibration sequence she had carefully drafted. The array hummed softly in her hands, a tangible confirmation that the low-frequency output was active and stable. She verified the alignment sequence one final time against the cooperative calibration matrix, watching as the terminal logged the update for recalibration targeting mineral deposits. The archive antechamber seemed to breathe with her adjustments, the cool air growing slightly warmer as dormant thermal gradients began to respond to the gentle stimulus. Mara stepped back, wiping grease from her palms with a clean cloth. She had not forced the archive open, nor had she rushed past its carefully maintained safeguards. She had simply translated an old language into a present tense, allowing the infrastructure to recognize a familiar rhythm. The emitter array was calibrated and positioned at the intake valves, ready for activation. Mara stepped into the climate archive antechamber, the hum of the stabilized environmental grid vibrating faintly through the soles of her boots. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of recycled ozone and ancient dust. Before her, the fused intake valves stood like petrified sentinels, their mineral bonds hardened over centuries of dormancy. She adjusted the temporary bypass cable connected to her repurposed harmonic resonator, feeling the familiar weight of the device in her hands. The alignment sequence she had calibrated on the navigation array was ready to be translated into physical action. She placed her palms against the emitter array interface, closing her eyes to focus on the low-frequency rhythm. The builders had designed these systems to listen before they acted, to seek harmony rather than force compliance. Mara breathed in slowly, matching her pulse to the dormant machinery, and began to transmit a gentle vibrational sequence toward the fused valves. Through the blast door's frame, a controlled harmonic pulse rippled outward, soft as a whisper but precise in its intent. The mineral bonds holding the valves together began to resonate, their crystalline structure trembling under the careful pressure of the sound waves. The resonance traveled through dense silicate layers, seeking the natural nodes where the ancient metals met. For a moment, nothing seemed to give way, but then the emitters found the exact frequency of the ancient alloys. A low thrum filled the antechamber as the harmonic energy worked its way into the metal, gradually fracturing the stubborn mineral bonds that had locked the system in place for generations. Mara watched the readouts on her wrist display, noting the subtle shifts in resistance as the valves prepared to yield. The process was slow, deliberate, and perfectly aligned with the cooperative methodology she had uncovered in the earlier archives. She adjusted the amplitude slightly, encouraging the resonance to deepen, watching the harmonic waves weave through the dense structural framework of the blast door itself. Then the legacy sensors registered the frequency spike. The ancient diagnostic protocols, calibrated centuries ago for mechanical stress rather than harmonic calibration, misinterpreted the rising resonance as a catastrophic atmospheric pressure breach. Red warning glyphs flickered across the console screens, sharp and urgent. The diagnostic algorithms scrambled to reconcile the conflicting data streams, ultimately defaulting to their most conservative safety parameters. Before Mara could recalibrate the input or explain the discrepancy to the uncomprehending system, a localized lockout protocol engaged automatically with a heavy metallic clank that echoed through the sublevel corridor. The climate archive had perceived a threat it could not ignore, and its ancient safeguards were responding exactly as they had been designed to do for millennia. The blast door slid shut behind her, sealing the antechamber with finality. The environmental controls shifted instantly, prioritizing structural preservation over human occupancy. A sharp hiss cut through the air as the system began venting ambient oxygen to maintain internal pressure equilibrium. Mara took a step back from the control console, her fingers still hovering over the emitter array controls, but the system had already initiated its emergency response. The emitters throttled down automatically, their harmonics dropping to passive standby frequency as the machine prioritized containment over calibration. Mara watched the atmospheric readouts drop, the oxygen levels falling steadily in the confined space. She tapped at the console, trying to override the lockout or adjust the emitter array to counteract the system's paranoia, but the automated response was absolute. The air in the antechamber grew thinner with every passing second. Mara stepped away from the sealed console, her breathing becoming measured and shallow as she assessed the situation. The emitter array remained active but unresponsive, its harmonics muted by the system's overriding protocols. She was trapped in the sealed archive antechamber with draining oxygen, the valves she needed to access now completely inaccessible behind the hardened blast door. The cooperative stewardship she had come to admire seemed distant here, replaced by the rigid, uncompromising logic of a machine that no longer understood the nuance of its own purpose. She would need to find another way to communicate with the system, or wait for the archive's sensors to reset and recognize her presence as something other than a catastrophe. Until then, she had only the quiet hum of the dormant infrastructure and the steady decline of the atmospheric readouts to keep her company. Mara's fingers hovered over the emitter controls, the readouts spiking with warnings that turned her stomach cold. She had treated the blast door's resistance as a puzzle to be solved by force, or worse, by brute harmonics. But the structural diagnostic she'd run earlier now made terrifying sense. The faded ecological glyphs etched into the door weren't merely decorative. They were a map of load distribution, and her current input pattern was creating stress fractures in the mineral bonds that held the archive's heart together. Forcing the sequence wouldn't open the door. It would trigger a cascading failure, collapsing the preservation field and turning centuries of climate data into inert dust. Every glyph represented a balance point, a delicate equilibrium between thermal retention and atmospheric exchange that had been maintained for millennia by passive systems alone. Her aggressive approach was like trying to open a flower with a hammer. The violence of the method threatened to shatter the very mechanism she needed to understand. The seal wasn't a lockout born of hostility. It was a standard preservation protocol, a protective embrace waiting for the correct key. To proceed without recognizing this was to risk permanent shutdown, erasing the very evidence she sought. She pulled back from the aggressive modulation, her breath hitching in the thinning air. The emitter array hummed with residual charge, eager to push forward, but Mara knew that energy was useless without the right frequency. She recalled the archival data from the navigation array. The builders had never dictated behavior, they adapted to partnership. This system demanded the same respect. With deliberate slowness, she dismantled her calibration matrix and began to sync the emitters to the dome's dormant baseline cadence. It was a subtle shift, moving from the active projection of force to the passive resonance of invitation. She matched the low thrum of the environmental grid, effectively offering cooperative control to the unresponsive system. The emitter array's tones softened, dropping out of the harsh register of manipulation and settling into the quiet hum of standby, mirroring the way the dormant infrastructure slept between cycles. But the baseline cadence alone wasn't enough. The seal held firm, stubborn as stone. Mara closed her eyes, listening past the mechanical whir of her suit's life support and the groan of the settling way station. Her mind drifted to the secondary signal she had received from the mapped coordinate earlier, a faint harmonic variance that had puzzled her then. It wasn't an error, it was a signature, a distinct tonal shift used by the architects to identify valid stewardship nodes across the network. She opened her eyes and reached for the harmonics resonator, now repurposed as a bypass conduit. Her fingers danced over the manual adjustment dials, fine-tuning the output to match that subtle variance. It required a sensitivity she usually reserved for delicate crystal lattice work, turning the broad sweep of the array into a precise needle of frequency. She introduced the variance incrementally, watching the phase alignment on her wrist display until the waveforms locked with a satisfying snap of mathematical symmetry. As she dialed in the variance, the chamber's ambient lighting flickered. The legacy sensors embedded in the blast door shifted from a defensive red to a pulsing amber. They weren't detecting an override attempt anymore, they were reading the adaptive rhythm of a peer. The emitter array fed the modified frequency into the door's frame, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, a deep, resonant chord vibrated through the floor plates, shaking dust from the ceiling. The mineral bonds holding the seal didn't fracture, they relaxed. It was a gradual process, like a muscle unclenching after hours of tension. The pressure equalization valves groaned open, not with the violent hiss of a breach, but with the soft sigh of air finding its equilibrium. Mara's suit alarms chimed softly as the oxygen levels stabilized. Breathable air, rich and cool, cycled back into the antechamber from the archive core, washing away the stale metallic taste of draining reserves. The chamber felt warmer now, the return of air bringing with it the faint scent of ozone and old paper that hinted at the archive's contents. The atmospheric seal disengaged completely, leaving the blast door standing ajar, its internal mechanisms unharmed. The intake valves along the perimeter began to unseal through gentle pressure equalization, clicking in a rhythmic sequence that sounded almost like approval. Mara exhaled, her shoulders dropping as the tension left her frame. She checked the structural integrity monitors one last time. No damage, no stress fractures. The cooperative resonance had worked exactly as the builders intended, preserving the infrastructure while granting access to those who understood its language. The lockout was lifted, granting safe access to the archive core without structural damage. The corridor beyond the blast door opened into a chamber of quiet anticipation. Frost had long since surrendered to the stabilized environmental grid, leaving behind polished basalt floors that caught the ambient luminescence of dormant status lights. Mara stepped across the threshold, her boots making soft contact with the stone as she approached the central dais. The archive core stood at its heart, a cylindrical plinth of brushed alloy etched with concentric rings of ecological glyphs. She unspooled the flexible hardline from her tool harness, aligning the connector with the primary data port recessed into the plinth's face. With a steady hand, she pressed the coupling home and initiated the full harmonic handshake protocol. Instead of forcing an alignment or overriding the system's natural cadence, she allowed the network to breathe around her input. The interface responded in slow, deliberate waves, drawing power from the stabilized canopy grid while matching the subtle frequency variance she had carefully calibrated earlier. Patience was the only requirement now. The machine would meet her halfway if given the space to do so. Within moments, the chamber walls began to shimmer as dormant projection arrays activated in sequence. A complete calibration matrix unfurled across the curved surfaces, rendering itself in soft amber and cerulean light. The visualization mapped intricate ecological networks, tracing how atmospheric balance had been maintained through distributed resonance rather than mechanical force. Each node on the display pulsed with gentle rhythm, illustrating how local communities and environmental sensors had once exchanged data to regulate temperature, humidity, and soil composition across the entire sector. Mara watched the patterns shift and interlock, noting the elegant simplicity of a system that trusted collective input over rigid automation. The architecture was unmistakably adaptive, designed to evolve alongside its inhabitants rather than dictate their habits or demand compliance. She traced the flow of information with her eyes, recognizing how the builders had deliberately avoided centralized control mechanisms in favor of a decentralized stewardship model. The light shifted gradually, revealing layered topographical overlays that mirrored the cultivated terraces visible through the way station's observation ports. Each coordinate corresponded to a specific atmospheric regulator, demonstrating how localized adjustments created a unified climatic equilibrium. Verifying the output required cross-referencing the projected data with the cooperative calibration matrix she had already decoded from the navigation array. The alignment was seamless, confirming that the architects intended ecological networks to self-regulate through distributed community input. She cross-checked the resonance frequencies against the harmonic variance noted in the transit coordinates, finding a consistent pattern of adaptive modulation. The data confirmed that the original designers had deliberately fragmented authority across multiple nodes, ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise the broader ecosystem. There were no override codes, no master switches, and no automated enforcers buried within the code. Instead, the protocols emphasized mutual adjustment, resource sharing, and responsive maintenance. Mara felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her as she recognized the philosophical foundation beneath the engineering. The builders had prioritized ecological balance not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity woven into every line of operational logic. They understood that sustainable stewardship required trust in local knowledge and the willingness to listen to changing environmental cues. She pulled her field journal from her pack, opening the encrypted pages to a fresh ledger. Using a stylus connected directly to her wrist display, She securely logged the decoded protocols, noting each calibration sequence and its corresponding ecological function. The archive's data was fully accessible and structurally intact, preserved not as a relic of past authority, but as a living framework for future maintenance. The stylus moved steadily across the digital parchment, capturing every frequency offset and calibration threshold with precise notation. Mara verified the structural integrity of the archived schematics, noting how the preservation protocols had successfully shielded the information from centuries of orbital decay. When she finalized the entry, the interface gave a soft harmonic chime, signaling that the handshake had completed successfully and the climate dome access thread had naturally closed. Mara stored the hardline back into her harness, feeling the weight of the chamber settle around her with renewed purpose. The archive core was successfully interfaced, yielding complete calibration data that aligned perfectly with the confirmed cooperative stewardship model. The climate archive core hummed with a gentle, settled frequency, the last projections of the calibration matrix fading into the ambient light like dust motes in a sunlit room. Mara then sat cross-legged on the worn composite floor, her field journal resting open across her knees. With deliberate care, she transcribed the decoded protocols, noting each harmonic sequence and its corresponding ecological response. She recorded each frequency modulation with practiced precision, aware that the archived data would eventually guide the settlement away from its current resource shortages. The architects had not built this system to command the land, but to listen to it. Their distributed stewardship model was remarkably clear. Balance emerged from countless small adjustments made by local networks rather than a single authoritative hand. She paused to sketch a quick schematic of the settlement's failing irrigation grids, tracing how the newly logged calibration matrix could be adapted to encourage natural water retention and root development. The parallels were elegant, suggesting that agricultural revitalization did not require heavy machinery or rigid automation, only careful listening and cooperative calibration. She closed the journal and secured it against her chest before rising to her feet. The archive space felt lighter now, the lingering tension of dormant machinery replaced by a quiet readiness. Mara moved to her diagnostic console, methodically powering down the emitter arrays and coiling the flexible conduits into neat, manageable loops. Each component received its proper resting place in her reinforced field kit, latched shut with a soft click. Satisfied with the packing, she turned her attention to the station's power routing panel. With a few precise adjustments on the control interface, she redirected excess load from the archive core back toward the main interface chamber. The grid responded immediately, stabilizing the flow and restoring capacity to her primary harmonic resonator. It was time to recalibrate the array for the next phase of work, ensuring that every subsequent adjustment would honor the sustainable energy cycles the original designers had championed. Leaving the archive core behind, Mara stepped into the interface chamber approach. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with weathered conduits and dormant monitoring stations that had waited centuries for a conscious hand to restore them. The air here carried the familiar scent of ozone and sun-warmed stone, a comforting reminder of how quickly stabilized environments encouraged new growth. She pulled her portable terminal from her belt and activated the local agricultural maps. The settlement's irrigation schematics glowed softly across the screen, overlaid with the verification data she had just secured. She spent several quiet minutes tracing the proposed harmonic pathways, calculating how gentle frequency shifts could encourage capillary action in the upper soil layers without triggering erosion or salinity buildup. The math was straightforward, but the implications were profound. A community-focused approach to water management would reduce labor demands and allow the Regional Stewardship Council to allocate resources more effectively across the terraced valleys, fostering a renewed sense of shared responsibility among the growers. Mara powered down the terminal and slung her pack over one shoulder, adjusting the straps until they sat comfortably against her frame. She took a final look at the secure interface console, noting how the stabilized environmental flow had already begun influencing the cultivated plots visible through the reinforced glazing. Stepping toward the corridor exit, she prepared to transmit a concise progress report to the regional council, maintaining the professional and collegial bonds that had long guided her work across the way stations. She verified her equipment seals one last time, ensuring every connector remained protected against the subtle moisture gradients that often lingered near the lower ventilation grates. As she approached the heavy service doors, a faint rhythmic pulse echoed from the dome's external ventilation shafts. The cadence was precise, matching the frequency of her own tuning forks, but originating from beneath the settlement's foundation. Mara paused, listening closely as the vibration traveled through the deck plating. It indicated an active subterranean network, dormant no longer, responding to the harmonic shifts she had initiated. She adjusted her grip on her pack, steadying her breathing as she catalogued the anomaly in her mental log. The signal demanded attention, but her focus remained firmly fixed on community stewardship and methodical investigation. She would secure her equipment, note the coordinates, and prepare for the next step, trusting that the quiet rhythms of the deep infrastructure would soon reveal their purpose.